I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we are looking at a poem that I guess some people might say is Chinese. Some people might argue it's not Chinese.
Ooh, tough statement, but also true.
The poem we're looking at today, I don't even know if it has a title. It is written by Abdukhaliq Uighur. His name, his pen name is Uighur. That's the name that he took for himself. Not surprisingly, Rob, he is a Uighur. And
that's crazy. Wow. I would never have guessed from his name.
It's actually more complicated than that because it's kind of, well, we'll get into that later, but it's not that he named himself after the Uyghur people, but sort of the Uyghur people named themselves after him, weirdly.
Interesting.
So this poem is written when he is in prison in 1933. I believe he's imprisoned and he's about to be executed. And he's, if I remember correctly, executed for his Uyghur nationalism. This is during the reign of some of the ethnic Chinese warlords in Xinjiang. So, think about 1933. I'm sure most of our listeners know that China was in turmoil. You had the KMT ruling over most of China, but they were a pretty weak regime. Japan is pressing down in the northeast. The KMT is trying to deal with that. They're trying to deal with the communist, who, of course, eventually, Rob, I think you will remember that the communists make a comeback.
Even I will remember. Right. Got it.
But Tibet is kind of being left on its own, as is Xinjiang. Xinjiang has a Chinese warlord in charge there, if I remember correctly, a quite brutal Chinese warlord. And there is this bubbling up of Uyghur nationalism. What's fascinating, so I said the Uyghur people kind of named themselves after this poet. And that's kind of a bit too much. Rob, am I getting too much in the weeds?
Possibly, although it is important to kind of set it up, because just saying, hey, we're reading a Uyghur poem, that'll give the impression, that will give, I think, a certain kind of impression. But this is important because, partly at least because of when it was written, 1930s, when people say, Xinjiang and Uyghur, people think of what's happening right now. But it's important to point out that some version of this has been happening for a very long time.
So when you say some version of this, you're talking about what's happening right now as we're speaking in 2022.
Yes.
So that's a great point. So just to I guess I'll keep going and rambling a bit, and then we'll get to the actual poem. The Uyghur people didn't really exist as a people, quote unquote, as a nation, quote unquote, and I'm using nation in the technical sense, before about the early part of the 20th century. Abdukhaliq was part of a kind of at the vanguard of Uyghur nationalism, and he was trying to construct the Uyghur into a single nation. Now, I know, listener, what you're thinking, Rob. I'm sure this is going through your head too. Wait a second. These people had a language. They lived in a shared area. They had a shared history. How are they not a nation? Like, that's the definition of a nation, right, Rob?
Well, yes, except I've read enough critical theory to find all kinds of holes in that idea. So please go.
Sure, but we're not doing critical theory. That's a good point, though. Thank you. Just to cover ourselves in case we ever get academic jobs again.
If you want, we can bring in Foucault and some others.
Please
but I
do
don't
not.
think that's where we want to go.
Please, we are not bringing in Foucault.
You're probably going to go. You're going to go Benedict Anderson on everybody.
I am going to go Benedict Anderson on everybody. Benedict Anderson, just for the listener, is the most important philosopher of the nation of nationalism, I think, in the humanities. You have this people, they have a language, but they don't have a single identity. Everybody identifies, all Uyghurs identify more with their oasis, more with their city. So you have Kashgaris thinking of themselves not as Uyghurs, but as Kashgaris, and you have people who are Uyghur, who are speaking the Uyghur language, but they're from Turpan. They identify more as Turpanese and Khotanese and all of the different oases in what is today southern Xinjiang. They have separate identities. They don't really hang out together. Just to put it into perspective, it took 7 days to go by camel from Kashgar to the Fergana Valley, which is in modern-day Uzbekistan. And actually, just to let everybody know, the Uyghur language is essentially Uzbek, which is essentially a form of Turkish, right? Like, Uyghurs and Turks can speak together in the same, without a translator.
And of course, most of our listeners will be at least partially fluent in Uzbek and possibly Turkish.
Thank you.
We're not going to need a lot more background than that.
It takes 7 days to go from Kashgar to Uzbekistan by camel. It takes 45 days to go from Kashgar to Turpan by camel. So, like, these are quite huge distances. People don't think of themselves as a single group if they can't, like, marry together, hang out together, that kind of thing. In the 1930s, the Uyghurs are under the rule of a very tyrannical Chinese leader, but that's kind of separate from the main part of China. Uyghur nationalism is bubbling up, and this guy, Abdukhaliq, and I'm slaughtering the pronunciation of his name, I'm sure. I apologize. Abdukhaliq starts to try and get people to think of themselves as a single nation, as Uyghurs. And so he adopts the name Uyghur, which had not really been used by the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs had not called themselves Uyghurs. Even in the 1990s, the Uyghurs oftentimes did not think of themselves as Uyghurs. They didn't refer to themselves as Uyghurs. They called themselves Musliman, which is just Turkish for Muslim.
And that's an interesting thing. I don't know if anybody out there is familiar with much Turkish history, but the founder of the modern Turkish state, Kemal Ataturk, his name is a little bit like Abdukhaliq Uighur's name. It literally means father Turk. Like he's sort of uniting people under one name, a single, not just a name like a nation name, but a personal name.
Yeah, and actually Ataturk, in constructing a kind of history of the Turkish people, used the Uyghur Empire, which was based in kind of Mongolia, as a like founding state for his own state of modern day Turkey. That is that country that's east of Greece and constantly at war with them.
You know, I want to get to the poem, Lee, and I want to set it up by saying first that it comes from a collection called Oasis Identities by Justin John Ruddleson. It's a really interesting book. The full title is Oasis Identities, Uyghur Nationalism Along China's Silk Road. Now, you gave me a couple of choices of poems. The reason I chose this one is because there is a line, or actually maybe a couple of lines, that remind me very strongly of what Chinese intellectuals were saying about China in the early part of the 20th century. Hey, Lee, do you mind if I just read it?
Go for it, please.
Since neither of us translated it, of course.
And we should point out that this is Ruddleson's translation. It's his work.
Yes. So here we go. This is by Abdukhaliq Uighur. Unsettled. We have a world-renowned name, Uighur. We are not less than these fools. We are not crippled. They have made such slanderous attacks on us. They call us turban heads. They put us in the same room with animals. We have no more patience left. Is this the life for us? We must take up arms and begin our struggle. We will cross all the dark mountains. I heard of the fighting in Khomul. It filled me with excitement. I jumped up from my bed. This war will shake the power of our oppressors. Our enemies have attacked and we have retreated. The situation is grave. We must liberate ourselves from exploitation. Those who are weak are those with the most enemies. Illiteracy is the path of the weak.
Ooh.
Not the most subtle poem ever written.
No.
But again, if you were in this situation, why on earth would you write a subtle poem?
Yeah, I mean, Rob, you're right. This poem does really remind me of early 20th century Chinese writers who are talking about the nation standing up. This rhetoric of standing up runs all the way through Mao, right? Like 1949, he gets on top of Tiananmen and says, 中国站起来, right?
China has stood up.
China has stood up. So it's interesting that this Uyghur nationalist is drawing off the same rhetoric and yet doing it in a kind of anti-Chinese fashion. I mean, the word he uses for turban heads is chantou, which is, I guess, a fairly insulting way in Chinese to refer to like the Muslims wearing things atop their heads. So he, I guess, is sneaking in a bit of Chinese into this Turkish Uyghur language poem, as I'm reading Ruddleson's translation.
one of the things that interests me about the approach this poem takes is the transition from they to we. So you start off by saying things like, they call us this, they put us in the same room with animals. But then he shifts it. We must take up arms. We will cross the mountains. And especially this line, we must liberate ourselves from exploitation.
Very communist.
One of the things
laden, yeah.
Very communist, but one of the sources I'm thinking of in Chinese is Lin Shu's translation of Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yes.
Because it's a lot of the same language. It's Lin Shu saying, look, the West is not going to help us here, right? Those of us who are being kicked around, we have to band together and take care of stuff ourselves, right? And I'm really curious what you make of this last line. Let's say the last three lines. Those who are weak are those with the most enemies. Illiteracy is the path of the weak. Now, that one line is the reason I chose this poem, because up until that point, it feels like, and I don't want to use the word, I'd think of it almost like a boilerplate revolutionary poem. Like, we're being treated this way, we have to rise up, throw off the shackles, et cetera, et cetera. So, violent revolution is low-hanging fruit, revolutionarily speaking. Illiteracy, though, gets at something a little deeper there. Because Abdukhaliq is not just saying, we have to do something about the way they're treating us. He's saying, we have to have something more, though, than just getting rid of these people or fighting them. There has to be an identity based on something much more than that. And that one line really interests me.
Remember how I mentioned that this was done in the shadow of a regime that was quite brutal and trying to cut down on Uyghur nationalism. One of the ways they did that is just they killed lots of intellectuals. So similar to what happened in Poland when the Germans and the Russians took it over, a series of fairly violent dictators controlling Xinjiang killed lots of Uyghur intellectuals, and those of our listeners who are outside of academia may or may not know, literacy is actually pretty key to nationalism. Everybody thinks of nationalism as like, oh, it's just this thing we're born into this nation. No, it's actually kind of constructed, and it's done through reading books. So Benedict Anderson, which we mentioned earlier in the podcast, he claims that there is this kind of imagined community that books create. And so you really can't have a true quote-unquote nation before the rise of printing. I would push back against that quite a bit in some areas, but still that's kind of his argument. And so if you have all of these Uyghur intellectuals getting killed, and most of the Uyghurs who are left are the ones who tend to be more illiterate, it's hard to become a nation. And I think that's why he's evoking this, like, illiteracy is the way to get lots of enemies and to have people oppressing you.
Right. And, and just to clarify for the listener, imagined community from Benedict Anderson is getting at an idea that I think is almost common sense when you think about what a nation is that in order for a nation to function, you have to believe that there are tons of other people like you doing the same kinds of things at the same time. So the specific example Anderson gives is the newspaper, where as I'm picking up, well, this is, we wouldn't do this anymore because we have apps and things, but back in the day when you would have gotten a paper newspaper every day, you're picking it up and at exactly that time, lots of other people are reading this newspaper. And something about that experience feels communal, even if there's nobody around you. And so one of his points is that a nation is constructed on these things. You have to believe that there's a lot of other people sharing this thing. And, you mentioned earlier in your intro to this, one of the things this poet is dealing with is, we all speak a language, but we're not an imagined community. Like, there's nothing that makes people imagine that we are united here. And it's interesting then that he has this poem, because it would be one thing to just say, hey, we need to stand up and do something about these people. But he ends with this, what feels like a very different cry. Like, you want to stop getting pushed around? Learn to read. And here's my question, Lee.
It's like reading rainbow nationalism.
It is like reading rainbow nationalism. Wow, that would be a great name for a book.
Can you imagine LeVar Burton with an AK in one hand and a picture book in the other hand?
I've seen Star Trek: The Next Generation, where he plays somebody who occasionally does resort to violence, so it's not entirely outside the realm of possibilities.
Yeah, fair enough.
But it is interesting because learn to read is not necessarily sort of a clarion call to battle here. And so I have a couple of questions I wanted to toss your way, because this is more your bag historically. So
Rob, you've never been to Xinjiang, have you?
I never have, and I always wanted to go because the Uyghur food that I ate in China was, alongside Sichuan food, my favorite. Incredible food. Holy moly. Anyway, when he says illiteracy is the path of the weak, is he talking about learning to be literate in the Uyghur language? How much is being written in Uyghur at this time?
Well, I think that one of the things he's doing is trying to create a Uyghur canon. He's trying to create a Uyghur poetry. I mean, stuff is being written in Uyghur. Uyghur has this long, illustrious history as a language. It's the Uyghurs who gave the Mongols a written script, right? Like, the Mongols had a language, and when they started taking over bits and pieces, they actually allied with the Uyghurs, and the Uyghurs created the Mongol writing system. The Uyghur language goes back for a long ways. You just have these intellectuals who are killed off. Who's writing stuff? I mean, today in America, in Europe, wherever you're at, in Hong Kong, how much do you actually write that will get remembered 100 years from now? It's not that many of us who do that. Like, Rob, you and I aspire to that, but in all honesty, we'll probably be forgotten. I was going to say footnotes in history, but
sure,
whether or not we actually get footnotes, that
would be awesome to be a footnote in history.
Right?
Are you kidding me? At the bottom of the page involving our era, we appear. Yes, please.
But then
there was this podcast. Dun, da, da, da.
But I don't even know if we'll land there. I mean, certainly we think about it, but most people in kind of 9-to-5 jobs, which if you think about the average Uyghur selling raisins in the market, right? Like, what do? They don't write anything. They don't do anything. The average, I'm just going to say it, schmuck on Wall Street, it's going to be forgotten about 10 years after he's dead. That's just kind of life. And yes, I did just compare a Wall Street banker to a Uyghur raisin seller.
It's exactly the same system of economics, my friend. Supply and demand. Anyway, classically speaking anyway. But so the question I was going to ask, though, is literate in what? Because one of the long-running debates through any colonized or abused or oppressed people group is, what are we supposed to read? So if we read just stuff written in our language, depending on the culture, you may be limited to only a handful of books or magazines or things like that, right? Or is it also important to learn to read the language of the oppressor? This is the long-running debate, especially in African colonized cultures. Like, look, we want to get rid of these guys. We got to learn to read their language too, so we know what they're up to, Some kind of philosophy like that was at work in the 19th century in China, where we're clearly getting our butts handed to us, so we need to figure out what's going on. Do you see an element of that at work? I mean, can you imagine a poet like this saying literate generally? Like, look, not just literate in Uyghur, but we got to know what the Chinese are up to also?
I'm not seeing that, Rob, but I also am not a specialist in this. I don't speak any of the Turkic languages, so I really can't say.
That's more an imagination thing. I don't read this poem and go, oh, he's clearly talking about Chinese too. But one of the reasons I asked you about the source question is to encourage a people to be literate in their language, but there's really not that much written in that language. That's tricky. Like, what are you actually asking for? Are you also then asking for them to go ahead and write stuff themselves? Maybe it's a dual call happening.
I think so. I think he is asking for more Uyghur poetry. That's kind of what I I think that's implicit in this, and he's answering that call by creating this poem.
So, it's interesting. Now this is why what's one of my closing thoughts here is this poem as a poem. I can't say I enjoy all that much.
But we're reading a translation, right?
Yes, very true. If we read this in Uyghur, it could be totally different. I don't know. In English, it feels very, very blunt, right? And like I said in the beginning, there's no reason he should be subtle in the slightest.
He's about to be executed, right? He's in jail.
Right. You're not going to write leaves of grass or something when you're about to be executed. So
I don't know, Boethius did.
That's true. That is very true. Well, there are exceptions to every rule, I guess. But this last line is still an interesting one. And I don't even know how it was intended, but like I say, it's the reason I chose the poem. I read it and went, that's an interesting way to end this poem.
Like Abdukhaliq Uighur, we'll just encourage our listeners to continue to fight illiteracy. Every time they download the Chinese Literature Podcast, they're becoming more literate on issues related to China. So we're doing our part, just like Abdukhaliq would have liked. I assume Abdukhaliq is looking down upon us and with tears in his eyes that we're completing his mission, I guess.
I have a feeling he's probably looking down on us, wondering why we're dedicating an entire podcast to a body of literature for a group of people who, according to him, are treating him like doo-doo. But on a more general,
at the very least, we can
level,
agree that he's looking down on us.
Wow, a theological discussion to end the podcast. I don't know this is going to goose our numbers very much, but it could be very interesting.
It probably won't be.
It probably would. No, I don't think that's ever goosed any numbers at all, ever. But anyway, it is an interesting poem. It's an interesting book. Anyone who's interested, not just in the Uyghur situation, but in the question of, what is Uyghur culture about anyway? This would be a really interesting place to go. Oasis Identities by Justin Ruddleson.
Rob, I think that's a great place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.